Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gill. I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy for Catholic Studies Academy. And today we are going to do a little bit of what I like to think of as more like calculus. I like to think of Catholic morality. Very similar. I think a good analogy to understand Catholic morality is to look at math. Some math is very simple. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. But there's other math that's more like calculus. Uh, it is as equally as true as 2 plus 2 is 4. It's just a little bit harder to get to. It takes some more steps. It takes some more training. And today, that's what we're going to look at with the principle of double effect. So in Catholic morality, we have, and especially we talked about this last week, that one of the things that I think distinguishes church doctrine and the understanding of the church's teachings is that she cares deeply about the morality of human actions, which is what we talked about last week. And so we want to continue that discussion today. And we want to look particularly at what the church calls the principle of double effect. It's a tool that we can use to analyze the morality of human actions in very specific cases. And again, as I said in the beginning, it's what I like to think of as more like calculus than maybe simple math. It still
Mhm.
is equally as true. It's just a little bit harder to get to.
Mhm.
So, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started? Maybe give us a quick review of what we discussed last week, and maybe give us
Sure.
a introduction to what the principle of double effect is.
You got it, man. So uh, you're right, Jason. Sometimes the principal double effect has kind of this notorious reputation for obscurity and for splitting hairs, but it's actually important. I think as we'll see
Yeah.
as we go forward, the morality of assessing the morality of human action, requires us to look at all of the morally appraisable elements of a human action. That's the way to think
Hmm.
about it. So a human action includes the very thing being done, which is the object. It includes the intention, right? So um, that is what's intended beyond the object of the action. So
Right.
kind of your ultimate motive, why you did the action would be a way of saying it. And then the circumstance of the action involve all those things, the properties or circumstances that stand around the action, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
time and place and the further consequences of the action.
Sure.
Those are where all of the circumstances stand. So you're going to look at the intended end, you're going to look at the object of the action, and then you're going to look at the circumstances, um, including the consequence of the action. Now, it's important that you do this, I think,
Hmm.
and it's important that you think about all of the different elements, right? Because if you can't assess what is a good or evil action, then really all of the other elements of moral life and moral philosophy break down, right? You
Yeah.
might say, and some people sometimes say, well, let's not worry so much about the casuistry, right, of an action. Let's just talk about the general morality of someone's life, right? Or
Yeah.
whether they
Yeah.
have a good or bad character. Well, here's the thing is how do you determine whether a character is good or bad or not? Well, what you
Right.
would say is, that someone's character is good if they're disposed to perform good actions, and bad if they're disposed to do bad actions. But then,
Yeah.
but then you have to still say, well, what is a good action? What's a bad action, right?
Yeah.
So you can't get away from this issue of determining that all of the other moral considerations, many of which are important, right? I
Hmm.
think character is very important. Still, ultimately, you have to come down to at some point, right? Concrete human actions and how you can tell whether a human action is good or bad. So, like we talked about last time, all of those moral elements have to be lined up and have to be good in order for an action to be good. Again,
Yeah.
the action itself, that's the very thing being done, the intended end, and the circumstances. What's unique, I think, to classical ethics, right, kind of natural law ethics,
Hmm.
one of the things that's unique is the insistence that some actions are evil in their object. So, as I
Right.
said last time, the primary way in which we distinguish the morality of human action, or the first and most kind of foundational, is the object of the action, right? Whether the action is good or bad in itself. Now, that said, um, that doesn't mean that we ignore the consequences. In fact,
Right.
the assessment of the consequences is very important in the assessment of a human action. Um, and and sometimes really complicated, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's where the principle of double effect comes in. I think sometimes people think the principle of double effect is sort of trying to save the theory or trying to kind of get out of difficult situations. I think that's kind of wrong-headed. I think the principle of double effect is a demonstration of the kind of seriousness of the problem of the approach, right? That is
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
that the moralists who developed this approach, St. Thomas and St. Alphonse Gorey and others, they recognize that life is complicated, right? And that often in this veil of tears, we have to engage in activity that from an abstract point of view, we might not want to, right?
Yeah.
But that we still have in reality, we have to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think for the Christian, the easy choices are the ones that are between good and evil. Those
Mm,
are fairly easy. But it's the harder choices are the ones that are between what's good and what's good. And
mm,
even in some of those cases, when doing what is good, there are going to be foreseeable bad consequences.
yeah,
Many
right.
times, we'll make choices that are, just think about how you spend your money. I
Hmm,
mean,
hmm.
okay, I have to, fix my roof. I'd rather have, this other thing. I'd rather do this other thing. But, like you have to weigh all of these different choices. It's a very light example, but
Hmm,
um, there's when we look at the consequences of our actions, the hard ones are
hmm.
going to be the ones where there's good, but
Hmm.
there is going to be foreseeable problems.
Yeah,
And again,
right.
I think it's also the church being mother. The church isn't just saying, well, do whatever you feel is best. I mean, no,
Hmm.
the church is saying, okay, this is a serious thing, enough to where we're gonna the church's tradition has devoted actually quite a lot of
Hmm.
research, writing, studies, and
Sure.
lives of the saints, writings of the saints to these moral principles and developing them in a way that we can use them to authentically judge the morality of a human action.
Right, right, yeah. And so when you're thinking about it, like the difficulty here comes in, like you said, with a good action. The actions say, could you have an action that's good in itself, but has consequences that are evil, right?
Yeah,
So just think about that for a minute. Think about another situation. We said in our last podcast, last episode, that it's sometimes an evil consequence corrupts what would be a morally good action,
sure.
right? Does that make
Yeah,
sense? Um, so that's a situation where like let's say that you were like wanting to watch a football game, right? And watching a football game in itself is morally permissible,
right.
but under these circumstances, it means that you're not going to get um, your work done for school the next day, right? Or the work you've been assigned by your boss is not going to get done, right? Well, because of that evil consequence, you'd actually say, in this circumstance, right,
Yeah,
watching the game is not morally permissible, right? Does
right.
that make sense, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because you're going to be failing in your duty as a student or your duty as an employee.
Yeah, and
Um,
the important distinction there is that the circumstances do not change the nature of the object,
mm,
but the circumstances can affect the morality of the whole human
sure,
action.
sure,
So the
right.
object still remains, always has to remain good,
Mm.
but the circumstances can change the morality of the human
Well,
action.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So in that one, what happened, right, is the circumstance has made your concrete watching of the game bad, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Under other circumstances, it'd be okay, but in this circumstance, it's not. Now, that said, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion then that evil consequences always corrupt an
yeah.
otherwise good action, right? So I'm trying to be clear and careful here, right? Sometimes an evil consequence will make an otherwise good action
Hmm.
bad,
Right.
right? Um, I want to be clear. Um, Good consequences don't make an intrinsically evil action good. Okay, so
Yeah.
we're talking about the case where there's a good action
Hmm.
and evil consequences,
Hmm.
right? Now, some might automatically just say anytime there's an evil consequence, the action is bad, right?
Right. The
And
consequentialist may say that.
that's right.
You
A
know.
consequentialist would say that, and we have to say that that's too simplistic,
Right.
and frankly, kind of practically naive. Um, it's just the case that in this world, we're going to sometimes doing the right thing. This is going to be hard to accept, right? Sometimes doing the right thing will carry with it evil consequences,
Yeah.
right? That's tough and it's unfortunate, but we have to remember we live in a fallen world, right? We don't live in heaven, right? And we have to deal with those situations where, again, sometimes doing the right thing to do carries with it, right, consequences that are evil. Assessing when it's possible to do that,
Yeah.
when doing the right thing carries with it evil consequences, that's what the principle double effect is all about. It's all
Yeah.
about trying to figure out when is it permissible to do a good action that carries with it evil consequences. Does that make sense,
Hmm.
Jason?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I think, first important for the Christian to first, if you know, many times the principle of double effect is applied to very serious matters.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's important to look at everything, and it's important to be clear as to okay, what are going to be the consequences? What are my intentions?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
because again, the as we go through this, we'll see that the when we're talking about a foreseeable evil,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that it has to lie in the consequences.
That's right.
We
That's
need
right.
to make sure that it is not in the intention, that it is not in the
Right.
object
Right.
itself,
Right. Right.
and
That's
stuff.
a
So yeah. So what are some maybe kind of the some of the first principles of the principle of double effect?
sure. So I just want to make a distinction real quick that
Yeah.
you kind of alluded to here, which is not everything that flows from an action is the intended end. So in scholastic
Right.
ethics and classical ethics, we distinguish between the intended end, which is a
Yeah.
consequence in a sense,
Sure.
right? But it's the intended end versus foreseeable but unintended consequences, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The intended end is psychologically your motivation, right? It's the psychological root of the action, right? It's what brings forth the action in the first place. It's your target. It's what you're shooting for, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's different from what you can foresee will flow from the action, right? But is so it's foreseeable, but it's not intended. So that's an important distinction there.
Yeah. And if it's kind of muddy for our listeners, don't worry. We're going to get into some examples
The
here in a
example,
little
that's right.
bit.
Yeah, yeah. All right.
Because
So
it is quite complicated.
right. Yeah, there's four properties or four
Hmm.
conditions for the principle double effect. So you can think of these as conditions that have to be satisfied for an action that's good to be
Hmm.
permissible, even with evil consequences. Right.
Hmm.
So that's what we're trying to understand. When is it permissible for an action that's good to be done, even though there are evil consequences that accompany it?
Right.
There's four conditions here. One is that the action itself must be good. So there we
Right.
start with that, right? We're not talking about doing evil for the sake of good. Okay, the good
Never
may come of
permissible.
it, right? That's right. Yeah, yeah. The end does not justify the means necessarily, right?
Right.
The end can corrupt the means, but it can't justify it. So there's the good. The action must be good in itself. The good effect must be independent of the bad effect. I'll say
Mm.
more about that in a minute. Three, the bad effect must not be intended, right?
Hmm.
So you foresee it, but it's not what your motive is. And then four, the evil effect must not be disproportionate,
Right.
right, to the good accomplished. So probably the two, so like the first and third one seem to me fairly simple in a
Yeah.
way.
Sure.
First, just the action has to be good, right? That's where we always start in a Catholic or kind of just really classical analysis, that it has to
Hmm.
be good in itself.
Hmm.
If the action's bad in itself, then I think you said last time we could just stop, right? Like we're
Yeah,
not,
yeah. The
right.
process. Stop the process.
Um, the third condition is that the bad effect must not be intended. So you must not be aiming for that, right? As your end, right? The
Right.
evil effect. So, but the second and fourth one have to do with the good effect has to be independent of the evil effect, and the fourth one, um, it has to have the evil effect can't be disproportionate to the good achieved. So, what you need to do when you're thinking about that's a little more complicated, right? So, what you need to
Yeah.
do when you're thinking about this is to think of an action, a thing you're doing, and that from that thing that you're doing, um, several foreseeable consequences follow,
Right.
right? Um, Several effects follow from that action. Okay.
Hmm.
So let me kind of flesh this out. I'll take a relatively benign example. Let's say that you're an unmarried man and you are pursuing marriage, right?
Hmm.
So you're trying to secure a marriage with a particular woman, and so you're courting her, you're dating her, that sort of thing. Um, you know also that ultimately you're trying to secure a accepted proposal, right? In a marriage, right?
Usually the
So
goal.
that's right. So, but you also know that your beloved is not only the object of your attention and affection, but also pursued by other suitors, right?
A
And
nemesis.
yeah, so there's competition, right? Um, so, but let's say that you win, right? That is, you do contract the marriage. Um, you do enter into marriage, right, with that person. One of the foreseeable consequences is that the other suitors are going to be depressed and disappointed,
Hmm.
right? That's not hopefully why you, you entered into marriage with a particular woman, right? You
To
didn't.
crush the souls of other men. Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
not.
You didn't like initiate a marriage with her in order to disappoint Bill, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like you're sort of like, too bad for Bill, you know, uh,
yeah.
you know. But what I was aiming for is the marriage state and all the blessings that follow from the marriage state, right?
It's independent of your
That's right.
intention
And
of.
so
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not intending the evil, but also Bill's disappointment isn't what brings about the good effect of the fruits of marriage. Does that make
Right,
sense?
right, right. Yeah, yeah,
So there the blessings of marriage are independent of Bill's disappointment.
yeah.
Okay, they're not causally dependent. And frankly, the disappointment of Bill isn't it's not so evil that it outweighs the goods that flow from marriage. Does that make
Yeah, it's
sense?
not like, the losers get annihilated or something like
That's
that.
right. That's right. They
Cease to
can go on
exist.
to try to pursue other marriages, right?
Yeah,
That sort of thing, right? You could do run the same kind of example with employment, right? When
sure.
you
Oh, yeah, yeah.
imagine with any job opening, there's, sometimes depending on the nature of the job, it could be anywhere from tens to hundreds of people applying for that
Sure,
position, right?
sure.
And if you get that position, that means excluding other people from that position, right?
Yeah,
And that even might be economically significant for the other people, right? Like imagine you're in a period of economic difficulty, right? The fact that you beat out somebody else might mean that other person can't afford to pay their mortgage.
yeah.
That's pretty serious, right? Of course, you might not be able to pay your mortgage if you didn't get the job, right? So, what you could say is, look, the thing itself, trying to get a job, that's morally good.
Hmm.
The effect of it is that you'll be able to pay your mortgage, support your family. That's what you're intending. That's a good action. Uh, um, you're not intending, right, the impoverishment of your competitors
Right,
there,
right,
right?
right.
And the impoverishment of the competitors is not the cause of you,
Yeah,
right, being able to pay your mortgage. That's important.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a fairly simple example there. Does all that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's to show the independence of the
Hmm.
the good action and
Hmm.
the evil consequence or the bad consequence that may come uh,
Right.
uh, naturally from it,
Sure,
playing it
sure.
out. What is going to happen if I do this?
That's right. That's right.
You know,
Yeah. So I think if you want to look at all the conditions together, that's helpful. And if we just kind of,
sure,
I think, kind of work through some examples, we'll work through a couple of examples here to try to illustrate the how this is applicable, and then maybe deal with a criticism or two at the end. But
sure,
some of these examples, I think, are more concrete to our ordinary lives. Some are more about kind of geopolitical kind of things,
hmm
but all of them, all the examples I think are helpful here. The principle of double effect is especially useful, I think, in military ethics.
yeah.
And we should actually think about this before we get on Facebook and start ranting our opinions. Okay, people have a
But
tendency,
that's one of
right?
one of the prerequisites to posting on Facebook is that you don't think about
You
it
don't
first.
think about it first. That's right.
It's just
That's
pure
right.
emotion.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like if I hate the present administration, of a given country, then it's just obvious, right, that
Yeah.
everything that administration does is evil, right? Um, so so obviously military matters, right? That we have to talk about military ethics at all is unfortunate, right?
Yeah.
With as we've talked about before, it's possible to be a virtuous soldier, those sorts of things. And the church, and kind of classical ethics in general is not pacifistic, right? It's not a pacifist approach.
Right.
But obviously, we wish it were the case that there were no wars, right?
Right.
You wish it were the case that you could just disband all the military, never even have to talk about military ethics, but it's not the case. And so we have to deal with how do we act well and morally within the undesirable situation of a war or military conflict. Um, it's really interesting. The scholastic theologians spent a ton of time actually really trying to think this through with a lot of care,
Yeah.
which I think is important. So probably the best way to think of this is with the issue of collateral damage. So
Yeah.
you'll hear that sometimes in like a news broadcast, or maybe read it in a news story with respect to a military action. So imagine our long-term military engagement in Afghanistan, or um, more remotely maybe in Iraq. Um, that sometimes you'd hear the phrase collateral damage used.
hmm
Collateral damage has to do with when non-combatants are not targeted
hmm
but end up being killed as a result of otherwise legitimate military action.
Right.
So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say that you are targeting a military fortification, dug in area um, that is in an urban area
hmm
where there are other citizens, where there are non-combatants around. Does that make my scenario
Sure.
make
Yeah.
sense? Okay. And so you launch an attack, maybe an artillery attack or something like that, or airstrike against that installation. In most circumstances, that's a legitimate military action, right? So,
hmm
with the proviso, the qualification, right, that you're pursuing a just war.
Yeah.
You win a war and pursue a just war by attacking the enemy, right? So, launching that attack against that installation is legit. Would be considered a legitimate military action.
hmm
Um, but because it's in an urban environment, it's also foreseeable that war is violent.
Yeah.
Large artillery shells falling on installation, blowing up buildings, causes widespread damage.
Yeah.
Um, Even if you try to be as precise as possible, right? These
hmm
are weapons of destruction, right? And so it's foreseeable that some non-combatants will get killed, right?
Yeah.
Does that make the military action? Is that sufficient to make the military action illegitimate? And I think what we want to say is not necessarily, right? We'd have to look at all these conditions. So first, is attacking an enemy installation, an enemy position, uh, legitimate in a just war? And
hmm
in itself, we'd have to say yes, so it meets the first condition.
Yeah.
Second, does the good effect, right, ultimately, hopefully, victory, right,
hmm
is it independent of the evil effect? So what we'd all agree that the death of non-combatants is evil, that is, it's undesirable.
Right.
Um, is the good effect independent of the evil effect? And I think in this case we can say, yeah, it is actually, right? That
Yeah.
is the it's not the death of the non-combatants that leads to the victory, right?
Right. Right.
Right.
Right.
It's the destruction of the enemy's military that leads to the victory. So although we don't want the death of the non-combatants, the death of non-combatants here isn't a means to the victory, right? So that the victory is independent of, that's the good effect, independent of the evil effect, which is the death of the non-combatants. Um, Ostensibly, right, you would of course, the bad effect has to be not intended. So you can't be sort of like, I really want to
Yeah.
get this military installation so that we can kill some non-combatants, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That if that's your intention, then the action has been corrupted. Imagine that you just sort of have like a hatred for a particular group of people or something like that. Then like you might say, okay, well that's bad, like you can't do it then, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's that's what 9/11 was.
Sure.
A particular group targeting non-combatants
Right, right,
to
right.
specifically hit at a country that they hated, of people
Hated,
that
right,
they
right,
hated.
right.
Yeah, that's a lot different than targeting a specific house or something like that we
Mm.
know an enemy combatant is in,
Right,
that may
right,
happen to be surrounded by non-combatants.
right.
Very
So,
different.
yeah, and then the final one is the evil effect can't be disproportionate to the good achieved.
Right. Right.
This is difficult to assess. Obviously, the loss of innocent human life, the loss of non-combatants, is a very serious matter.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, hopefully you had a serious reason to go to war in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And so, the victory of a just war does, I think, outweigh the foreseeable but unintended death of some non-combatants.
Hmm.
Now, I think you have to be careful there. It doesn't justify anything, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to be taking out a relatively minor uh, enemy position, right, and it's going to cost the lives of several thousand non-combatants, then you would say we shouldn't do that, right?
Yeah, like a nuclear weapon. I mean, the goal of a
Right,
nuclear weapon is just mass destruction
right,
and
right,
death and
right.
carnage.
Yep.
You can't say, well, there's let's just say Osama bin Laden's still alive. Well, he's in Afghanistan. We should drop a nuclear bomb. We will definitely kill Osama bin Laden, but we'll also, all of Afghanistan will be wiped
Right,
off
right, right, right.
we're not going to do that,
The
and there's
disproportionate.
even, you even hear other examples of, where enemy combatants even, hide in hospitals or
Mhm.
orphanages and things like that. The United States still, in cases like that, uh, uh, don't engage in that kind of thing, because again, the disproportionate
Right, right,
nature
right.
of the bad effect to
Yeah,
the good effect. They may
probably.
wait, they may do something else.
Mhm. Probably one of the more controversial issues. I'll just bring it up because it's interesting to think about. Right, of course, is you know the use of nuclear weapons, right? Because they don't do a good job of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants.
No.
They're called weapons of mass destruction for a reason. Um, and you'd have to really wonder about whether or not such things could be used. Now I know that actually there are some highly differentiated kinds of warheads and weapons, and
Sure.
you could maybe imagine, maybe some small scale things being used in very specific circumstances. But you know, um, overall, it's you'd say in most cases or almost all cases, if not most, then such weapons shouldn't be used
Right.
because of uh, the disproportionate evil, right? That's struck. I think one that's kind of interesting to think about is the firebombing of Dresden in World War II. It's a pretty notorious
Hmm.
action, that was committed by the Allies against the city of Dresden in Germany. Um, the firebombing is a specific kind of attack that's massive, right? It doesn't distinguish between um, combatants and non-combatants at all. You're just
Yeah.
basically trying to burn down a whole area,
Yeah.
regardless of who's in it. Now, I don't think we need to be overly. I mean, if there's going to be military action, things are going to get rough sometimes.
Hmm.
That's a good reason to be very hesitant to get into them. But yeah, it's complicated, and the way you'd have to assess that is by working through the principal double effect.
Hmm.
Let's get at something maybe a little more close to home, a little more
Sure.
common. What about arresting someone, right?
Yeah.
Arresting somebody who's committed a crime. Well, if you think about it, um, that's a let's say that you've gone through all the right procedures,
Hmm.
right? So you have good reason to think this person needs to be arrested, or at least arraigned, taken to jail, to be tried, right? So
Yeah.
you've gone through the legal procedures that both respect the rights of the citizens and help make sure you have good evidential
Right. Right.
processes and all that sort of thing. So this was a good arrest, right? Now you think about when you arrest someone, you're taking away their freedom,
Yeah.
at least temporarily, right? That's what it means to arrest them, right? You think about the cuffs literally get put on your hands, right? You're
You are
not
not
allowed to
free.
go where you want to go, right?
Yeah.
Um, so in some cases that's a good thing because we don't want you to get away. We need to figure out something about you, whether or not you're
Sure.
guilty or something. And let's say maybe we do find out that you're guilty and that you're tried, and then you're imprisoned. Okay. Well, the good effect there, right, is that justice be upheld in society, that society be protected, all those sorts of things, right?
Hmm.
Punishing a malefactor is good in itself,
Hmm.
right? And it has a good effect of upholding justice within society, as well as other things. But there are also some evil effects, right,
Yeah.
of imprisoning someone.
Sure.
Um, One of them certainly is going to be that it can have a negative effect on the malefactor's family, right?
Yeah.
You might, the malefactor, the criminal in question, might be the primary breadwinner of that family. Um, he might not be a terrible guy. He might be, just a criminal. So like his children and his wife are going to lose, his support, his help, his comfort, and all those sorts of things, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, it brings notorious reputation upon the family. All those sorts of things, right? So there's a lot of evil effects that happen to the family of the
Sure.
malefactor when we imprison him.
Hmm.
Does that make the imprisonment of malefactors wrong, Jason?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, I mean, a good way to avoid those kinds of effects is don't commit the crime. Recently, Jason, we went through some controversial issues where there was all of this, kind of just outrage, right, over people being separated from their children for having
Mm.
committed a crime,
Yeah.
right?
A
If you
serious
can,
crime. Yeah.
yeah, if you commit a crime, right, like this is something that happens.
Yeah.
It's sad, right? It's tragic, but those are the consequences of the crime, right?
Right.
It doesn't make the action bad. So, although we can sympathize with and the suffering of a family that is caused by, um, the imprisonment of a family member, imprisonment of a father, imprisonment of the, husband. At the same time, we can say, look, justice needs to be upheld. Justice is essential to
Right.
the common good. The
Right.
common good's greater than the individual good. And so, although it's unfortunate, right, that
Yeah.
the children are deprived of their father, and that a family is deprived of his support, uh, his imprisonment is not an effect, right, of the suffering of the children.
Yeah.
His
Exactly.
imprisonment
Exactly.
is not disproportionate to the evil done. Um, and in itself, it's a good action, right? That the malefactor be punished. Does that example make sense to you, Jason?
Yeah. Yeah. It does. And even in uh, our current you know uh, legal system, not every crime is arrestable. That would
Mm,
be that would be completely unjust. It'd
sure,
be like,
sure, sure.
like Footloose or something, where
Uh,
you're
uh,
you're going to jail for dancing, or something like that. like that's completely disproportionate. Like the
Mm,
the evil committed of dancing to, you know, the removal of the breadwinner from the, like that's a
mm.
ridiculous example. That
Sure,
would be
sure.
something like that. Or even, you know, speeding or something like that. We don't arrest people for speeding and things
Right, right.
because again, the negative and bad effects of
Hmm.
the arrest and everything else that flows from that is completely disproportionate from, you know, going 10 miles over the speed limit.
Sure, sure.
So, you know, in your example, you know, there is the, you know, the the issue of proportionality and stuff,
Sure,
but
sure.
it is, but like you said, you know, in you know, in cases where, you know, they are committing, according to our legal system, an arrestable offense,
Hmm.
justice has to be upheld in a way, like you said, that protects the common good, and in the understanding that the common good, um, uh, it's higher than the individual good. It's greater
Right,
than it.
right. Yeah, I think that's important to bring in view. Do we have time for one last example? I know we're kind of running a little bit long here,
Yeah,
but
sure.
okay. So one last example I would say is this it might be kind of a little bit complicated, but so considered in itself, right? Contraceptive, the use of contraceptions, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes people think it's kind of funny the way people think about this event. But like, let's say that you're talking about oral contraceptives, right? You know, if you're, I mean, it would be kind of a silly thing to do, but let's say that you were celibate,
Hmm.
right? And you just took contraceptives orally. Just you just did it, right?
Yeah.
That's not sinful, actually. There's nothing. It'd be kind of weird and pointless and useless, right? But there's nothing in itself, right, that would be wrong.
Yeah.
That makes sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The problem is contraceptive sex, right? It's not, so um, the so what we want to think about then is, well, what about, say, the taking of a medication,
Hmm.
right, that has a contraceptive side effect,
Hmm.
right? Now, notice I said side effect. Let's say that it has some other medical benefit, some real medical benefit, right?
Sure.
Um, but it has the foreseeable but unintended consequence of rendering marital actions non-fecund.
Hmm.
Um, I think what you could say there is that that is morally permissible, right?
Yeah.
Again, on on the condition that the medication is having some good medical work, achievement, effect that's not the result of the contraceptive effect. Does that make
Right.
sense? Right.
Yeah, it's
So
not intending it, and the contraceptive, the abortive facet side of it, or the contraceptive
no, the
side of it,
contraceptive. I
is
think
not the,
about
sorry, the contraceptive
yeah,
side.
right, yeah, okay.
Sorry, the contraceptive side is not the cause of the good effect.
That's
So
right. That's right.
it's
Yeah,
not in the intention, not the cause.
that's right. And it's the medical work being done there, right?
Yeah.
Is not the contracepting, right, or the
Yeah.
preventing of childbirth, right, or child, the conception of a child, excuse me, but rather some other, right, good medical effect, right. So
Right.
that would be a situation where we could do that, where one could take a medicine that had that side effect unintended, right.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, you know, one last example. I know I said the last one's the last one, but just one more.
Yeah.
Let's
Whatever.
just say you had this happens, right,
You're good.
sometimes in families where you have an older child living in a family, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's like 18, 19, 20, something like that, you know, maybe going through college or getting training or, you know, just
Sure.
getting started. And so if that child becomes rebellious, right, or kind of morally vicious, right,
Mm-hmm.
is a parent justified, right, in banning that person from the home, right? Sort of in effect
Yeah.
exiling a child. Let's say it could also be like, let's say that you know, maybe you've moved out, but you're engaging in vicious behavior, publicly notorious. You know, can a parent exile you from the home? And I think, you know, obviously nobody wants to do that. No parent ever thinks, oh yeah, I
Sure.
want to kick my kid out of the house, right?
I don't know.
Um,
Sometimes I think that.
the but you have to think,
Yeah.
well, are there, you know, that might be the right thing to do though, right? Especially if you have younger children in the home
Yeah.
who you don't want to, you know, be influenced badly or scandalized in the strict sense,
Mm-hmm.
then you might say, okay, like I have to protect my younger children
Mm-hmm.
from your behavior. And so you have to be removed from the home. The
Mm-hmm.
good effect there is the protection of the innocent. Now, are there going to be evil effects, from
Mm-hmm.
that, Um, yeah, probably. you
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of sorrow, a lot of anger. There's going to be a lot of broken relationships
Yeah.
there that are tough. But right, you can't. But um, it could still be permissible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're protecting your family. Again, the evil effect, the good effect, the protection of the family, doesn't flow from the anger or pain of the person. The good effect just flows, of the person you've exiled. Um, the good effect flows just from their absence,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Not from
Their exile or
yeah,
all the other bad effects, broken relationship. You're not
yeah.
breaking the relationship. You're simply removing them from the home and things
That's
like
right.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the pain, right, that's there that
Yeah.
they're going to or anger. I think this comes up, when you're thinking about, sometimes our friends maybe expect us to go along with something or support
Yeah. Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
right? And you do think, maybe I shouldn't, that sort of thing. And that will, maybe the like say let's say that you can't, for a variety of reasons, can't go to your friend's wedding.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, this is morally wrong what you're doing for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to have some negative effects, but you have to think about sort of the bigger picture there.
Yeah. All right. I'll throw in my last example then.
Okay.
Uh, and we'll wrap this up because I want to make kind of I think an important part when you're really discerning some of these situations, and this is probably, I think, one of the most common ones you find on the internet, but I think it's 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 good in its example and illustrating this, and that's the example of the mother
Oh,
who
right.
finds herself pregnant with uterine cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a woman who is pregnant, and at the same time she has her uterus has cancer in it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the mother's life is at stake, which means the baby's life is at stake also. And so the doctor says, well, the the procedure in this case is to remove the cancer, and the
Mm-hmm.
survival rate is actually fairly high, because the cancer, as long as the cancer is fairly located in that one spot.
Right.
Um, so the intention is to save both. The intention does have to be to save both the mom and the baby if possible. The action is going to be removing the cancerous uterus,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the very worst and bad consequences, it might be the death of the child, or
Mm-hmm.
foreseeable uh, consequence is going to be the death of the child. Um, the church says that is permissible because
Mm.
the intention is not to kill the child.
Right.
The 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 death of the child is uh, um, a bad consequence of the
Right.
removal of the uterus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it is not in the intention, and it's not in the action. And I think a
Yeah.
good way when we're looking at a situation, I mean, probably most of us will not be in this particular situation, but when we're looking at a situation, say, that can be compared to this, when you look at, say, the bad consequence of the death of the child, maybe say remove that. Say, okay, what if that bad consequence was not there?
Would the action
What,
be bad?
what would yeah well or
Yeah.
what would the action be? And like in this case, the intention and the action would be exactly the same.
Right.
You
Right.
would
Right.
intend to remove the cancer, and the action would be surgically removing the cancerous uterus. So in that case, you can really see a very, very bad effect, a very, very bad consequence,
Right. Right.
being independent from the action, and then something like that proportionally. That's a difficult one to work through, but I think in that case,
Sure.
that's, I mean, that's a whole lot different than, say, a mom who just says, well, I didn't want a child, and the child will be, something like that. The child will
Right,
be a
right.
complete
I think, yeah. So
inconvenience.
what
So
you're not saying, Jason,
yeah,
right? To be clear here, is that um, abortion in order to save the life of the mother is permissible.
no, never.
Okay, so I think it's going to be hard sometimes for people to see the difference between that and what you're
Yeah,
saying, right? Can you
yeah.
articulate that difference for us?
Yeah, so abortion is the direct killing of an innocent human child,
Right.
at whatever stage of
Mm-hmm.
development. Um, the action here is the removal of a cancerous uterus.
Right. Right.
It happens. The consequence, or the circumstance,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
that uterus happens to also be occupied by a fetus in a
Mm-hmm.
particular stage of development.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
The action here, but again, and that's why I say, in our discernment of it, it's important maybe to just for the sake of your own uh, mental processing, to remove that bad consequence and say, well, would I be doing something really different if
Right.
that bad consequence was there?
Right. Right.
No, I wouldn't. The
Yeah.
procedure would be the same, but we can never intend.
Mm-hmm.
We can never have an abortion to save the life of the mother. You can
Right.
never intend, or
Right.
just say, well, we need to abort the baby and then it'll be fine.
Right. I
you can
think,
you
yeah.
can you can never do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right on, Jason. So one of the things you would say is, well, what's the direct action, right?
yeah,
What's the thing itself being done, right? Is it directly removal of a cancerous uterus, or is it the termination of the fetus, right? If it's the
yeah,
termination of the fetus, then it can't be done.
right,
If it's another medical procedure that's otherwise morally good and it has the unintended and sad consequence of bringing about the termination of the fetus, then yeah, right.
yeah. the,
Um,
the medical procedures are very different
that's
in
right,
both of those
exactly.
cases.
That's very
They
important.
may have, and again, they may have, or the consequentialist would say,
Mhm.
they have similar consequences.
Right, right,
So they're essentially equal. No,
right.
because we don't look at just the
Jessica.
consequences. We don't just.
So, and another thing you want to bring out here is that in the case you're talking about, the good effect, that is the preservation of the life of the mother, is not a result of the evil effect,
Right,
right?
right, right.
The problem here isn't the child, right? The problem
Yeah,
is the cancerous uterus, right? So I
yeah,
think that's an important thing to bring about, right? To recognize, right? Is that this here saving the life of the mother is not an effect of terminating the fetus.
yeah, yeah. And the doctor can never intend that either. It
Right.
still has to be, it still has to always remain in and there, hopefully science can, progress enough to
Sure.
where in the future this is kind of a long lost discussion,
Mm-hmm.
where we're able to save both
Mm-hmm.
in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's, the church cares just very deeply about these moral issues, to the point where we will go into kind of this kind of detail and analysis,
Yeah.
and that's important for Catholics to understand, that it's not just, the reason why we have the principle of double effect is not just because, scholars got bored with morality and they said, let's come up with something new to make it even
Yeah.
more complicated. No, they saw, that there's not a simplicity to human actions that
Mhm.
sometimes people think there is.
Right. Yeah. I
um
mean, I think you have to at least say sometimes life is complicated, right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
you need a morally adequate an adequate theory is one that helps you to think through those complications, right?
yeah,
Um, and I mean, I have very little sympathy with people who sort of just want to fluff off this kind of analysis
yeah,
as, oh, it's just too complicated, or you're just trying. What are you talking about? Like sometimes life is complicated, right? Like
yeah,
and we're faced with tough choices. Do you just want to say, well, when it's a tough choice, you just throw the dart against the wall and figure it, who knows,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right? Like, no, like it's not just who knows, right? We need to do at least the best we can, right, to figure out the morally right thing to do if we're going to be ethically serious people.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is uh this understanding, this application, this seriousness. Again, I go back to, my analogy of math. We don't
Mm,
throw off the architect saying, there's all these angles and things you want to do. This is way too complicated, you know. But at the same time, you know, like I can build a doghouse, I can't build a house. I have to go seek help, and that's important for the Christian as well. You know, if there's something that's you're stuck in a moral situation, seek help. But you know, don't go to, you know, neighbor Bob just because, you know, you like Bob and, you know, Bob has a nice house or something like that. But go to somebody that is an expert, somebody that would be a good guide when it comes to discerning moral decisions. We do have, while we may not always have the tools to discern correctly, what we do have is the moral obligation to seek guidance, and the church is there to provide that guidance as a mother and as caring for us. Um, again, I always go back to calculus. There's a difference between calculus and simple math. It just, you know, just because one is a little more difficult doesn't mean that it's less true or that we can simply set it aside because we may not be able to do it. It just means that, you know what, it's a little more difficult and we need a little more help, and the church provides that help, you know, in the principle of double effect. Dr. Smith, any final thoughts?
No, I think you hit it right on. I just, you know, I think this is a great heritage, you know, that's been passed down. You know, this, you know, both in the last episode we talked about assessing the moral elements of a human action, and then applying the principle of double effect in this episode. You know, this is kind of classical scholastic ethics, and it's useful and it's rigorous and it's detailed. Not just for the sake of being detailed, not just for the sake of being complicated or rigorous, but because life is that way, and in that way, I think it's one of the more useful and helpful aspects of classical philosophy.
Amen. All right, folks. Well, that does it for us today. In the meantime, check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. I just want to throw out there that Dr. Smith will be rolling out a new course here in a few weeks.
Yes.
So be on the lookout for that one. What are we doing this time?
Modern philosophy.
Modern philosophy. Speaking of doing calculus.
Some
of this is just wrong math. But check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.